Hi there, everybody. Rabbi Leah here, bringing you Hi There with Rabbi Leah. I hope you're all doing well, and it's good to see you again. See you again. I was able to see a lot of you yesterday when I was at Seacrest, and hopefully you are watching some of this programming so that I can keep my face in front of you, even though it may not be live and in the flesh. So, for those of you who missed Tuesday, I just want to do a brief review. I've started on a new topic, a new series, so to speak, and I'm hoping that many of you will find it of interest. I have to tell you that in doing my research, I am learning a tremendous amount, and I love being able to pass some of that learning on to you. So I hope you'll continue to join me for Tuesday and Thursday mornings at 9:30 for Hi There. And so here's what we're talking about now, in case you missed it on Tuesday. As I mentioned, I have found that I often get the question, what is the difference between the various denominations or streams of Judaism? And coupled with that question is often the misunderstanding by a number of Jews as to what these different movements are really all about. And many people will continue to identify with the movement in which they were raised, not fully understanding the tenets of that movement or how it may have changed over the past 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and whether or not that is a movement with which they really still want to identify. Perhaps it doesn't fit the mold of their Jewish belief or practice now. So I started by talking about that word denomination, which really has more of a Christian connotation. So in Judaism, we prefer to use some of the more some different labels or different terminology than denomination, such as movements, branches. I didn't mention this yesterday, but branches, trends, streams, and I've even heard the term flavors of Judaism. That one's reserved for the gastronomic Jews who love Jewish food, and that's the extent of their Jewish identification. There are cardiac Jews who have a love for it in their hearts, and there are gastronomic Jews who have a love for it in their taste buds and in their stomachs. But I like the words branches because branches grow, right? They are alive. Trends are things that move and change. Streams flow. Movement reminds me of dance movement or walking. So all of these imply that these different entities within Judaism are not static. They move. And even in Orthodoxy, there is movement. There are huge differences between Haredim, Lubavitch, Chabad, and modern Orthodoxy. So um, this is um, this is a these are terms that look at Judaism as something that is flexible, changeable, and moves as opposed to something which is rigid and static. Okay, so I'll be using terms like branches, trends, streams, movements, as opposed to the word denomination to talk about these different entities within Judaism. Um, so one of the things that I did not talk about on Tuesday is the fact that many of these different streams of Judaism um, reject the characterization as being a sect, S-E-C-T, because sects are traditionally defined as religious subgroups that have broken off from a main body. And although some of these streams of Judaism are practice differently, have different observances and rituals and beliefs, practices, and so on, they still consider themselves to be Jewish. They are not a separate sect that has gone off on its own completely to form a new religion. So that's how Judaism, that's how these different streams of Judaism don't traditionally define themselves as sects, but really as religious subgroups that have maybe broken off from the main body, but are not a completely separate entity. Within Judaism, individuals and families can often switch affiliation. I know many people who grew up as Orthodox or conservative, and now they would call themselves Reform, although sometimes I'm not 100% convinced that they understand what it means to be Reform, other than they like the Reform congregation better, but don't really know what identifying as Reform truly means, which is fine. That's what this course is going to be about. So one can switch affiliation within Judaism and still be Jewish. An Orthodox Jew is free to marry a Reform Jew, although there may be some considerations in terms of who is Jewish and some sort of training or conversion process may be required, which is a whole other subject. But the relationship between and amongst Jews generally says that we can interact with one another. Now, I'm not talking about some of the political stuff that goes on between certain movements within Judaism and others, but for the most part, Jews are considered Jews. Relationships between Jewish religious movements, however, can be varied. Sometimes there's cooperation, and sometimes there's not. Halakha, Jewish law, seems to be the sticking point in full cooperation among Jewish movements. And, I don't have to get into any of the details. You've seen it, you've experienced it in your own lifetimes. But in other ways, there is tremendous cooperation. For example, community federations, Jewish federations, are multi-movement organizations. Campus organizations like Hillel are often represented by all Jewish movements. And so there are distinct Jewish ethnic divisions and political divisions, but there is also a high level of cooperation amongst some of these other organizations. So I don't want to dwell on that. Yesterday, I showed you a what I call is the family history, and it's this very elaborate ancestry chart, which I'm sure is impossible for you to see on the camera because the writing is so little. In fact, I have to kind of squint to even see it. But we are, and by we I mean Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Humanist, Reconstructionist, Modern Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox, and Post-Denominational, starting down here. So you could see that there's all this before you even get to this. And I would propose that there's really no way of understanding what this is about unless you know what this is about. But knowing what this is about makes this much more understandable. So we are going to spend some time on this, which means we're going to have to do a little history. We're going to have to understand how did we get from Abraham and eventually Moses to a female rabbi in the pulpit. And it's a long history, but I'm going to do it in bite-sized pieces so that you can enjoy it and understand it. And hopefully this will give you some context so that we don't just say Reform Judaism is about this and conservative is about this and Orthodox is about this, but how did we get to these different movements? You know, where did we come from that eventually split us into these different branches of the Eitz Chaim, of the Jewish tree of life? So we are going to start a long, long time ago, about 2,300 years ago, actually a little bit more recently than that. Biblical Judaism, which, if we look at the writings of the Torah, ended with the death of Moses. Now, Moses is believed to have lived around 1300 BCE. Okay? We're not going to get into a discussion about whether or not Moses, the man, existed or didn't exist. That is a whole different conversation that we can have as well. But if there was a man named Moses, wonderful. If there was a man named something else on whom Moses was fashioned, that's fine as well. And we can discuss those issues perhaps at a different time. But Moses, around the year 1300 BC, and then up to BCE, and then up to the year about 600 BCE, was a time that we call Biblical Judaism. So after Moses' death, Joshua was given smicha, he was ordained, he became the leader of the Jewish people. And then, of course, we had the judges and then the reigns of the different kings and so on. But around the year 9, well, let's go back. After Moses died and after the reign of the kings, we had the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, which was then rebuilt after the Babylonian exile and then destroyed again. But a lot happened in that period of what we call Second Temple Judaism. And there were a number of different descendants of the original tribes that inhabited Israel following the death of Moses that arose during this Second Temple period. And that Second Temple period is considered the time from, let's see what I have for dates here, up until from about 600 BCE until the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE. So you have to understand the history of some of these groups to figure out how we got to Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist Judaism. So here's what happened. There are a number of groups, 4 in particular that I want to talk about. I want to talk about the Samaritans. I want to talk about the Essenes. I want to talk about the Pharisees, and I want to talk about the Sadducees. And I bet that everybody watching this program has heard of the Samaritans, the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. And perhaps you even studied these groups at some point in an adult education course, in a college course. But I think that it's important to see who these groups are, their relationships, and how they began the early movements within Judaism that eventually led to Rabbinic Judaism, out of which the rest of the Jewish streams are going to flow. Okay, so the group known as the Samaritans regard themselves regarded themselves, and still do, as direct descendants of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, who were Ephraim and Manasseh? Ephraim and Manasseh were Joseph's sons, Jacob's grandsons. They were not Jewish, at least not according to halachic Jewish law. Their mother was an Egyptian. So I guess you could say they were half Jewish and half Egyptian. And on his deathbed, Jacob gave these two grandsons each a half portion of what all the other tribes got. So according to biblical Judaism, these two grandsons of Jacob, were Jewish, because in biblical times, the Jewish, an individual's Jewishness was determined not by the mother, but by the father. That changed, as we all know. However, at that time, biblical times, and after biblical times, Judaism was determined by the father, not the mother. So the Samaritans are descendants of, they consider themselves to be the most ancient of the Jewish tribes. They were in the northern kingdom because during Second Temple times, Israel was divided into two kingdoms, which were Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And the Samaritans lived in the kingdom of Israel, which was in the north, which was conquered by Assyria in the year 722 before the Common Era. And in fact, there are still about 820 Samaritans alive today who consider themselves to be the absolute ancient remnant of the Jewish tribes. Modern genetics has looked at some of the claims of the Samaritans, and they preserve the Pentateuch, which is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, in slightly variant forms from the way that other Jews do. And the first historical references to the Samaritans date from the Babylonian exile, which was in the 5th century of the Common Era, about 585 BCE. So according to the Talmud, the Samaritans are to be treated as Jews in matters where their practices agree with mainstream Judaism, but otherwise they're treated as non-Jews. And so there are really only 2 very small Samaritan communities left nowadays in Israel. One of those is located in the Israeli city of Holon. The other is located near Nablus on Mount Gerizim, which is in the West Bank. And according to the Samaritans, Mount Gerizim is considered to be the holy mountain, not the holy mountain where the temple was built, not the Temple Mount in Jerusalem that most of us consider where the temple stood. So today, a Samaritan has to officially go through a formal conversion to Judaism if they're going to be considered Jewish for purposes of marriage and so on and so forth. One of the original or ancient names of the Samaritans, their last name is Tzedakah, or Tzedakah, coming from Tzadok, which means righteousness. And so I wonder if Neil Tzedakah is really a remnant of the Samaritans. So they are, as I mentioned, a very tiny group, but they have grown. And if you look at their numbers, they actually were down to about 70 members hundreds of years ago after the Assyrian attack, and they have grown to, I was able to find most recently about 820 right now. So the Samaritans were north in Israel, and then there was the land of Judah, which was the southern part of Israel. Okay, so another one of these sects during the Second Temple period were the Pharisees, and you've heard that word, the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were the ancestors of what eventually became Rabbinic Judaism. So I look at this Second Temple period as being between 515 before the Common Era. So that's about 2,500 years ago, maybe a little bit more, and the year 70 of the Common Era. And that's when the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots, who are a very interesting group, were part of these different movements within Judaism. And, you know, it wasn't always peaceful. They did war amongst themselves. So the Pharisees were the more democratic, more open, more loving sect at that time. They were as I said, the progenitors of the rabbinic Jewish movement that eventually, after the temple was destroyed, became the predominant form of Judaism because the temple was destroyed. The priestly cult was no longer in existence because there was no temple to do sacrifices in, and so on. And so the Pharisees were the founders of what was to become Rabbinic Judaism. And there are a lot of different historic sources that we can find, like Josephus and the New Testament, some recovered fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls that talk about these divisions among the Jews. And there are also rabbinical writings from later periods, like the time of the Talmud, that further attest to some of these schisms. Although my beloved professor at Hebrew Union College, Rabbi Dr. Michael Cook, says the word is not schisms, it's schisms. So look that one up. So the Pharisees, as I mentioned, were one of these predominant movements. Then we had the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees are extinct, and they were the upper echelon of the priests and the priesthood. So they were very politically influential. They derived from the Hasmonean dynasty. This was all done through being born into it, and so on. So it sounds very much like there was a caste system going on here, where we had the Pharisees, who were the kindly rabbis. We had the Sadducees, who were the political and influential priesthood, and so on. And the Pharisees were the ones who kind of were, the word Pharisee actually means separatists. So they separated from this priestly cult. And if you read about the Pharisees, they really wanted to maintain the authority of the traditions of classical Torah teachings. And they were the ones who began the early teachings of the Mishnah, and they maintained the authority of the Sanhedrin versus getting politically connected to the Romans. And according to Josephus, the Jewish / we don't really know what he was, because he was so many things, or at least proclaimed to be during his lifetime, said that the Sadducees differed from the Pharisees on a number of doctrines within Judaism. Notably, they rejected the notion of life after death, which the Pharisees promoted and believed in. So they appear to have dominated the aristocracy and the temple, but their influence over the wider Jewish population was very limited. And so it is Pharisaic Judaism, which morphed into Rabbinic Judaism, which is responsible for the Judaism that most of us practice today. So you see why I'm introducing you to these ancient sects, because I think it's important that we know who our ancestors were. So most of us today, in fact, probably all of us today, since the Sadducees are extinct, derive from Pharisaic Judaism. No longer the priestly cult. Okay, two more. I don't know if I'm going to have time for them both, but we'll try. So another group that developed were the Essenes, and the Essenes came into being around the 2nd century before the Common Era, and then into the 1st century of the Common Era. Now, what was happening during that time? Think about this. 2nd century before the Common Era into about the year 100 of the Common Era. That was the rise of Christianity at the beginning. And the Essenes practiced poverty, celibacy, adherence to Shabbat. They were what we know as the Dead Sea sect. The Essenes were the ones who went to live in the Judean desert, lived a life of poverty and a sparse life, a very community-oriented, mostly male population, and were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had within them scrolls that had, until 1948, when they were discovered by these 2 Arab shepherds, had never been found before. The scrolls of darkness and light, and differences in the Torah scrolls from the Torah scrolls that we have today. So these amazing discoveries. So the Essenes left Jerusalem, they left the north, they came to Judah in the south of Israel, to the Judean desert. They lived these very, I hate to use the word, but Spartan lifestyles, because the Spartans are, definitely a different element here, but they lived this very sparse lifestyle. And needless to say, the Essenes also died out, because they were, although there are Jews who practice ascetic type Judaism, which is a very plain, pious, impoverished type of Judaism. So we've covered now Samaritans, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and I think I'm going to wait on the Zealots, because they're a very interesting group. Some of you may consider yourself to be zealous, but not a zealot. I don't know. We will take that up again next Tuesday when we meet again for Chai There with Rabbi Leah. And so far on our chart, we are getting to be right here with the Essenes and red in early Christianity, which developed out of Second Temple Judaism. That is where it came from. So we're going to talk about that as well. And when we get to modern Judaism, we are also going to talk about Messianic Jews and Jews for Jesus, and decide whether or not we think that is actually representative of Judaism. So, Chai there and bye there. I'm going to say Lehitraot for now. Don't forget, tomorrow night we have blessings at 4:45 p.m. before Shabbat. Saturday morning, Shabbat services at 10 a.m. And then no Shabbat Chaverim this Saturday, but Saturday evening at 6 o'clock, Havdalah. So Lehitraot, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.